The afternoon light over Riverstone Commons had that particular quality that October carries in Virginia, low and amber and slightly tilted, the kind of light that makes everything look more expensive than it already is, which in the case of Riverstone Commons was saying something considerable, because this district had been designed from the ground up to signal that the people who moved through it had arrived somewhere worth arriving at. The pavers were polished granite. The restaurant signage was brushed brass. The parking structure smelled of fresh concrete and something floral that no one had specifically requested, but that appeared to be piped in at regular intervals the way casinos pipe in oxygen to make you feel slightly better than you would otherwise feel about being exactly where you are. Sheriff Darius M. Caldwell crossed the second level of that parking structure at 3:29 on a Thursday afternoon in October, carrying nothing but his phone, his wallet, and his keys, the way a man carries things when he has just come from a working lunch and is heading back to an afternoon that has 3 more hours of paperwork in it. He had parked here earlier at 12:47, in the spot nearest the elevator, because he had arrived early enough to have options, which was how he had operated for 33 years. Arriving early enough to have options. The Escalade was exactly where he had left it sitting in the second row with that particular stillness that a well-built vehicle has when it is resting, the obsidian paint so dark it seemed to absorb the parking structure's overhead light rather than reflect it. The chrome trim catching just enough of the amber afternoon to hold your eye for a moment before you looked away. Darius pressed the key fob in his right palm. The headlights flashed twice, a clean, bright pulse in the dim structure. The side mirrors unfolded with a quiet mechanical precision. The door locks released with a solid, satisfying thunk that echoed briefly off the concrete pillar behind him, a sound that was simultaneously ordinary and, on this particular afternoon, about to become the most important fact in the next several hours of his life. He had taken 2 steps toward the driver's door when a hand appeared against it. Not reaching for it, not touching it with any particular urgency, just placed there, flat-palmed in the way that someone places a hand on a surface to claim it. The gesture so casual and so certain that it required a specific kind of confidence to execute. The confidence of a person who has never in their life placed a hand on something and had anyone question it. The man attached to the hand was Preston Whitfield. 54 years old, pressed khaki pants, and a club polo shirt in a shade of blue that cost more than it looked, carrying the specific posture of someone who has spent years practicing the art of being correct before the facts arrive to confirm it. He had just crossed from the direction of the Caldwell Club, the private membership establishment at the east end of Riverstone Commons, and beside him walked a woman in a camel-colored coat who was already raising her phone. Celeste Whitfield had missed the moment the vehicle responded to Darius's key. She had been half a step behind Preston, adjusting her coat collar, and by the time her phone was oriented toward the scene, what the camera saw was a man with pressed khakis, and a hand on a car door, and another man, a black man in a jacket 3 steps from the curb, both hands rising slowly to chest height, the vehicle responding, the locks releasing, the mirrors unfolding. None of that was in the frame. "Keep both hands away from that vehicle," Preston said. His voice had the flat, unhurried register of a man giving instructions he fully expects to be followed, and the sentence itself was constructed in the grammar of authority, not a question, not a request, a directive, delivered with the certainty that the social physics of the moment would enforce it. Darius stopped 3 steps from the curb. He kept both hands at chest height, palms slightly open, fingers loose, the posture that communicates compliance without submission, the posture that a man learns when he has spent 33 years navigating the specific mathematics of being a black man in uniform in the American South, where the line between authority and danger is sometimes thinner than a badge. "I own the vehicle," he said. "Remove your hand from it." Preston did not move. "Those signals can be copied," he said, nodding toward the key in Darius's right hand. The key that had just caused the headlights to flash and the mirrors to unfold and the locks to release with a sound that was in the parking structure's brief stillness, unmistakably the sound of a vehicle responding to its owner. Electronic systems can be cloned. That proves nothing. Beside him, Celeste stepped closer to the vehicle and tightened her camera angle. and in doing so, she eliminated from the frame the 3 clear lanes of open space behind her, the 3 routes by which she and Preston could have turned and walked away from this at any moment, which they chose not to do, which was a choice that no one watching her video would be able to observe because the open lanes were no longer in the picture. "He's becoming aggressive," she said, tilting the phone slightly downward to capture Darius's hands and jacket, while leaving Preston's hand on the door outside the frame. Darius kept his voice level and low, the particular vocal register of a man who has conducted enough interviews and depositions and high-stakes conversations to understand that his tone is always being evaluated more carefully than his words. "I have not moved toward either of you," he said. Across the lane at the traffic flow monitoring station near the structure's second-level entrance, a woman named Vanessa Okafor had been watching since before any of this began. Vanessa was 41 years old, worked for the parking management company that operated this structure under a city contract, and had been at her station when Darius crossed the level and pressed his key and the vehicle responded, which she observed from approximately 30 feet away with the direct unobstructed angle that her position naturally provided. She had entered the plate into her work tablet immediately, a habit, not a decision, the kind of procedural reflex that years of managing vehicle incidents develops, and the record came back in under 10 seconds. Registered to Darius M. Caldwell, Caldwell County. No flags, no alerts, no theft report attached. She recorded the time, 3:31 p.m., and then she hesitated. Because on the active construction notices posted at 3 separate points in this district on the permits and the development barriers and the signage that marked the 2 buildings currently going up within sight of where she stood, the name Whitfield Development Group appeared, and she had been working in this district long enough to understand that witnessing an incident was a different thing from placing your name inside one, particularly when the incident involved someone whose name was on the construction barriers outside your workplace. So she hesitated, which lasted until Preston raised his phone to call 911. She heard him describe the situation to the dispatcher. She heard him use the words attempting, steal, still, here, each one carefully chosen, each one building a structure around Darius that moved him further and further from the simple fact of a man with a key standing near the vehicle. That key opened. A fact that the parking structure's own gate log and Vanessa's own tablet record already confirmed, sitting in a database that the responding officers might never think to examine. She heard Preston add as an elaboration that the man had some kind of electronic device, the key fob, that had just activated the vehicle, and that he was now confronting them. Darius opened his left hand to show it was empty, and displayed the key in his right palm, the physical answer to a claim that no physical evidence supported. "He's becoming hostile," Preston said into the phone. Darius made one slow, deliberate movement. He crouched and placed the key on the pavement between his feet, the metal making a small, precise sound against the granite, and then he straightened and returned both hands to chest height. The Escalade remained unlocked behind Preston, patient and unchanged. Preston continued talking to the dispatcher. He added that the man might be armed, not that he had seen a weapon, not that Darius had reached for anything, but that he could be, the way that speculation dressed in the grammar of concern functions as a fact in the automated systems that translate 911 calls into patrol alerts. The dispatcher asked whether he had observed a weapon. "No," Preston admitted, "but he keeps reaching for things." Darius had reached for nothing since placing the key on the ground. Celeste tightened her camera angle further until the frame contained only Darius and Preston's hand on the door, with no context on either side. Which is to say, with no truth on either side, which is how a story becomes something other than what happened. Vanessa picked up the internal dispatch handset. "This is Vanessa Okafor at Riverstone Commons Parking Level 2 Traffic Monitoring. I need to attach a witness statement to the active vehicle call." She gave her name, location, license plate, and timestamp. The reported individual approached the vehicle alone and used a key that activated the headlights, the mirrors, and the door locks. The callers positioned themselves against the driver's door after the vehicle responded to his key. I have not observed the reported individual threaten either caller or prevent them from leaving. There are 3 open lanes directly behind the callers at this time. The operator confirmed the note had been added to the file. 2 patrol vehicles entered the structure before Vanessa could ask whether it had been transmitted to the responding officers. There are things about a man that a parking lot cannot tell you, things that exist in the decades before the specific Thursday afternoon when someone places a hand on his car door and decides from a distance of 6 feet that he cannot possibly own it. Darius Marcus Caldwell was 57 years old, and the story of how he came to be standing in that parking structure with his hands at chest height and a key on the pavement at his feet is a story that begins not in Riverstone Commons, but in the East Side neighborhood of Caldwell, Virginia, in a house on Meridian Street that his parents had purchased in 1971 for $32,000, and that still stood, repainted twice and re-roofed once at the address where Darius had spent the first 18 years of his life. His father, Robert Caldwell, had worked the overnight shift at the Caldwell County Water Treatment Plant for 31 years, which meant that Darius had grown up in a household where the primary sound of Tuesday mornings was his father coming through the back door at 7 a.m., with the particular exhaustion of a man who had been keeping other people's water safe while they slept, and who would sleep now for 5 hours, and then get up and help Darius with his homework and never once suggest that the arrangement was unfair. Robert had applied for the supervisor position at the plant 3 times over the course of his career there. The position required a letter of recommendation from someone currently working inside the building, and in 31 years, no one inside that building had ever offered to write one for Robert, and Robert had never asked directly, because asking directly would have required a conversation that the building was not prepared to have. He retired at 62 with his original title, his original rate of pay, adjusted for inflation, and a card signed by everyone in his department, some of whom had worked alongside him for over 20 years, and who had shaken his hand warmly at the retirement party and would not have recognized him on the street 6 months later. Robert Caldwell died of a cardiac event 4 years after his retirement, at 66 on a Tuesday morning, which was a day he had always been awake for. Darius's mother, Gloria, ran a licensed in-home daycare out of the house on Meridian Street for 22 years, 6 children at a time, $90 a week per child, every dollar recorded in a spiral-bound notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer beside the utility bills and the children's emergency contact forms. Because Gloria Caldwell understood that the difference between a business and a hobby was whether you kept the records, and she kept the records. Darius was the first person in his family's history to attend a 4-year university, which was Virginia State, and which he paid for through a combination of academic scholarship, federal Pell Grant money, and the fact that Gloria worked Saturday overtime at a second part-time job for 2 consecutive years, which she had not told him about until after he graduated, and which she mentioned then only because he had asked why she looked so tired in the photographs from his freshman orientation. He had joined the Caldwell County Sheriff's Office at 24, fresh out of Virginia State, with a criminal justice degree and the particular quality of stillness that men develop when they have grown up watching their fathers absorb things quietly and have decided without necessarily naming the decision to carry themselves the same way. He was the only black man in his academy cohort of 11. He did not make a point of this at the time. He simply outperformed 10 of the 11 in every category where performance was measured, and the 11th had been a college wrestler. The 33 years that followed were a study in the accumulation of credibility through work that no one gave him credit for until they had no choice but to, which is a specific kind of career that requires a specific kind of patience. The kind that is less like waiting and more like building something in a room where people keep walking through and rearranging what you have built while you are not looking, and the work is to keep building anyway. Corporal at 31, sergeant at 38, lieutenant at 44, undersheriff at 50, elected sheriff of Caldwell County at 54. The first black sheriff in the county's 140 years of keeping that particular record, which it had kept carefully. The election margin was 2,200 votes. He had won it precinct by precinct, door by door, in a county where the political establishment had not imagined his name on that ballot until his name was on that ballot, and where certain members of that establishment had spent significant money ensuring it would not be, and where the 2,200 people who disagreed with that investment had driven the point home in the particular grammar that elections speak. He had bought the Escalade 8 weeks before the Thursday afternoon in October, the first vehicle he had ever purchased new from a dealership at full asking price, without a financing arrangement, and the significance of that sentence would be invisible to anyone who had never had to finance a used car, because the math on a new one didn't work, but it would be entirely legible to anyone who had. The color was obsidian black, and that was not an arbitrary choice. When Darius was 9 years old, he had sat in a waiting room with his mother, a doctor's appointment, a routine thing. And there had been a magazine on the table beside him, one of those automotive publications with a car on the cover, and the car on the cover had been black in a way that he had never seen a car be black before. Not the flat, dusty black of older vehicles, but a deep, liquid, absolute black that seemed to contain the light rather than reflect it. And he had stared at it for the entire 20 minutes they waited, and had thought with the uncomplicated certainty of a 9-year-old that this was the most serious and beautiful thing he had ever seen. He had sent Gloria a photo of the window sticker when he bought it. She had called him back within 4 minutes, which was fast for Gloria, who was not a fast caller. "Baby," she said, "your daddy would have cried." He had not said anything for a moment. Then he had said, "I know." Now he was standing in the parking structure at Riverstone Commons, with that car unlocked behind him and a man's hand pressed against its driver's door, and he was listening to a 911 dispatcher receive a story being built in real time, word by careful word, each one moving him further from the simple and documented fact of a man who drove here at 12:47 and parked and went to lunch and came back and pressed his key and watched his car respond. He had the badge in his inside jacket pocket. He was fully aware of this. He was aware that he could reach into his jacket right now, slowly and with narration, and produce the credential case, and the moment Preston Whitfield read the seal of the Caldwell County Sheriff's Office, this would be over. Preston would recalibrate. Celeste would lower her phone. There would be an apology constructed in the language of misunderstanding, and by tomorrow it would be a story Preston told at the club, with himself as the protagonist. A man who takes neighborhood security seriously, who couldn't have known, who made a reasonable call given the available information. No record, no consequence. No reckoning for the automated system that had just translated Preston's repeated speculation into an escalating threat alert heading toward 2 police officers who were about to make a decision based on it. And no answer to the question Darius had been carrying for 33 years, which version of the system shows up when it thinks no one important is watching he wanted to see. He crouched and placed the key on the pavement, the small metal weight of it making a precise, quiet sound against the granite, and he straightened and put both hands back at chest height, and he waited for the thing he had spent his career building to either hold or collapse in the next 20 minutes. And he was prepared for either answer, because he had learned a long time ago that you cannot know what a system will do under pressure until it is actually under pressure, and the only honest test is the one that is actually run. The Escalade sat unlocked behind Preston's hand. The key sat on the pavement between Darius's feet, and 2 patrol vehicles turned into the entrance of the parking structure's second level, with their light bars beginning to pulse against the concrete walls. Preston Whitfield had not started with money. This was important to understand about him, not because it excused anything, but because it explained the particular shape of his certainty, which was the shape of a man who had once stood on the wrong side of a door and had spent the subsequent 30 years making absolutely sure no one ever put him there again. He had grown up in Harrowfield, a working-class suburb on the western edge of Caldwell, where the lawns were smaller and the cars were older, and the distinction between the people who had what they needed and the people who wanted more than they had was visible in the specific way that distinctions are visible when there is not quite enough money to make them invisible. His father, Gerald Whitfield, had sold insurance door to door for an independent agency that covered about 40 square miles of Caldwell County, driving a Buick with a cracked dashboard and an air conditioning unit that worked on alternating Thursdays, and Gerald had referred to the residents of the Caldwell Club, the private membership establishment on the east end of what was now Riverstone Commons, as the people who matter, and he had said it without irony, the way you say things that you have accepted as simply true. Preston had absorbed this taxonomy at an age before he could evaluate it, which meant it went into him the way things go into a child, not as a belief he chose, but as a fact about the world that he simply carried forward, the way you carry your first language. He watched his father be dismissed by those people his entire childhood. Watched him stand in their foyers with his briefcase and his Buick and his conviction that this appointment would be different, that this time the conversation would go far enough that the clipboard came out and the signature happened, and watched him come home most evenings with the briefcase still closed and the particular quality of quiet that men carry when they have spent the day being told, in ways too polite to argue with, that they are not quite the right fit. Preston had decided at 14, with the specific and uncomplicated clarity of a 14-year-old, that he would never be on that side of a conversation again. He had not been. Whitfield Development Group had begun as a two-man permit filing service operating out of a rented office above a dry cleaner on Harrowfield's commercial strip, and its early success had come not from Preston's understanding of construction or development or urban planning. He had majored in business administration and understood the transactional architecture of deals rather than the physical architecture of buildings, but from his instinctive understanding of the relationship between people who wanted things done and the people whose signatures made things happen. He had spent 12 years learning which city council members played golf at which courses, which ones preferred cash-equivalent gifts structured as consulting fees, which ones needed their children's college application essays reviewed by someone with the right connections, and which ones simply needed to feel at the crucial moment that they were doing something good for the community rather than something good for Preston Whitfield. He did not invent this system. He had simply studied it more carefully and implemented it more efficiently than anyone else who was looking at the same information, and by the time Whitfield Development Group submitted its first public contract bid, the outcome had already been determined in 3 separate conversations that had taken place on 2 different golf courses and at one dinner that was categorized on 2 different expense reports as a business development meeting. He had applied for membership at the Caldwell Club 6 years ago, and the process had cost him $85,000 in initiation fees and the better part of a year spent in the particular liminal space of being evaluated by people who would never say out loud what criteria they were applying, but who were nonetheless applying them with great precision. He had passed because his money was large enough by then to make his origins negotiable, which was not the same as making them irrelevant, but was close enough that the distinction could be maintained with reasonable comfort by everyone involved. The club gave him the thing his father had never had, which was a room where he was not the one trying to get in. He had a particular contact within the Caldwell Police Department, not the sheriff's office, whose jurisdiction was county-wide and whose elected leadership he had never thought much about, but the city's own police department, where a man named Deputy Chief Howard Greer had been useful on 3 separate occasions over the preceding 4 years. The relationship with Greer had been cultivated the way Preston cultivated all his relationships of this type, gradually through adjacency rather than transaction, through the campaign fundraiser donation that was slightly larger than necessary, and the dinner invitation that came at a moment when Greer was navigating something professionally difficult, and found that having someone like Preston in his circle made that navigation slightly smoother. Greer had made 2 previous situations involving Whitfield properties disappear from active case files. Preston had not asked him directly. Greer had not explained what he'd done. They operated in the grammar of implication that powerful men in mid-sized southern cities have used for generations, the grammar in which nothing is said directly and everything is understood precisely. But on this Thursday afternoon, standing in the parking structure with his hand on the door of Darius Caldwell's Escalade, Preston was not thinking about Greer yet. He was operating on the instinct that had served him for 30 years, the one that told him that when he defined a situation, the situation stayed defined, that his assessment of what he was looking at was the relevant assessment that a black man standing near an expensive vehicle in a premium district was a fact that required explanation, regardless of what any electronic system had just done in response to a key. He had not recognized Darius, had no reason to. The county sheriff's office occupied a building on the other side of the courthouse complex from the city facilities where Preston's permit work took him, and their jurisdictions touched in administrative documents rather than in the rooms where Preston spent his time. He simply saw what he had always seen when he looked at this particular configuration of things, and he had acted on it with the automatic confidence of a man who has never once been made to account for the conclusions he reaches before the evidence arrives to support them. He had been made to account for a great many things before. For cost overruns and missed deadlines and permit applications that required revision. But never for this. His hand tightened on the door handle as the sound of the patrol vehicle's engines echoed up the parking structure's ramp. The officers were coming. The situation was being resolved in the direction Preston had pointed it. This was how things worked. He could feel it working, the machinery of it turning in the reliable direction it had always turned. He didn't look at the key on the pavement. Celeste Whitfield had been married to Preston for 22 years, and in 22 years she had learned a great many things about how he moved through the world, the most useful of which was this. Preston stated facts and she provided the emotional credibility that his flat authority lacked. He was convincing in the way that a balance sheet is convincing, accurate within its own terms, presenting a clean picture, but missing everything that does not fit into a column. She provided the columns that a balance sheet does not have, the ones that held fear and concern, and the performed vulnerability of a woman who had every right to feel unsafe, and whose feeling unsafe was within the frame of the moment, indistinguishable from an actual threat. This was not a strategy they had designed together. It was a pattern that had emerged across years of navigating situations that required more than one register of persuasion, and by now it was as natural as breathing, each of them moving into position, without needing to discuss the choreography. She had started recording because she understood instinctively that documentation was the difference between a story that lived in memory and one that lived in the record. She had been half a step behind Preston when he placed his hand on the door, which meant she had missed the vehicle responding to Darius's key, which meant her video began with the scene already in motion, a man being confronted near a vehicle, a man who was in her frame already, the suspicious element, rather than the owner whose key had just unlocked everything. She understood what the frame was doing. She did not think of this as deception. She thought of it as emphasis. You pointed the camera at the thing that mattered, and the thing that mattered was the man who was in her assessment, where he did not belong. This was the fundamental error, and it was an error so deeply embedded in how she had always seen the world that it did not register as an error. It registered as accuracy. Celeste ran the Caldwell Architectural Heritage Council, which was a non-profit dedicated to the preservation of what their mission statement called the authentic character of Caldwell's historic neighborhoods, a phrase that, in practice, meant the character of the neighborhoods in which people like Celeste had chosen to live, which were the neighborhoods from which people unlike Celeste had been gradually and procedurally moved over the preceding 40 years, through mechanisms that no one in those neighborhoods had designed explicitly, but that everyone had benefited from explicitly. The council had successfully opposed 3 rezoning proposals in the past 7 years, each one of which would have introduced affordable housing units into districts that the council's membership described in their public filings as already at density capacity, which was not accurate in any technical sense, but which was the kind of inaccuracy that sustained itself through the specific confidence of people who expected to be believed. She had called the non-emergency line twice in the preceding 2 years, once about a painting crew she did not recognize working on a house 4 doors from hers, who turned out to be a fully licensed residential contractor whose company had been in business in Caldwell for 11 years. Once about a man she described to the dispatcher as an individual I don't recognize walking along the property line, who turned out to be the owner of the adjacent parcel, walking the edge of a fence he was planning to replace. Neither call had resulted in a record of the pattern being kept. No system had flagged her as a repeat caller whose descriptions had a consistent relationship with the actual facts. The calls existed in the log and nowhere else. Now she was recording and she was narrating, and the narration was building alongside Preston's words to the dispatcher to create something that felt to anyone who heard only the audio without watching the available space around them like a genuine and escalating threat. He was not cooperating. He was becoming hostile. He wouldn't let them leave. Across the lane, Vanessa Okafor was watching the angle of Celeste's phone with the specific attention of someone who has spent years managing vehicle incidents in confined spaces and who understands the relationship between camera angle and context, which is to say the relationship between what a camera shows and what is actually happening. She could see the 3 clear lanes behind Celeste and Preston. She could see that nothing was preventing them from leaving. She could see the key on the pavement. The Escalade still unlocked Darius's hands at chest height, with the patient stillness of a man who has made a decision and is executing it. She had already attached her statement to the call with her name and timestamp and the specific sequence of events she had observed from 30 feet away with an unobstructed sightline. The note was in the system. The question was whether the system would transmit it to the right people before the wrong thing happened, a question to which Vanessa did not yet have the answer, and which she was watching the entrance to the parking level to determine, because the answer was going to arrive in the form of how many patrol vehicles came through that entrance and how fast they were moving when they did. They came through at 3:37 p.m., 2 vehicles moving fast enough that their tires made a sound against the ramp's concrete that Vanessa could hear from her station. Celeste heard them too. She kept recording, but something shifted fractionally behind her eyes, a small satisfaction, the expression of someone who has set something in motion and is watching it arrive, and who has not yet understood that the arrival might carry consequences she has not modeled. She had always believed that the consequences in situations like this arrived for other people. She was not wrong about that, historically speaking. She was about to be wrong about it for the first time. There is a change that happens to the atmosphere of any space when police vehicles enter it with their light bars running, a change that is partly visual and partly something else, something more fundamental, a shift in the social physics of the space that makes everyone who is not a law enforcement officer become, for a moment, aware of themselves in a slightly different way, aware of their hands, aware of their expression, aware of the question of whether they look like what they actually are. Officer Daniel Merritt stepped out of the first vehicle. He was 31 years old, transferred to this district 8 months ago from a quieter precinct in the county's western quadrant, and he was still in the process of learning the particular language that this district spoke, the way that wealth and public space and police presence interacted here, which was differently from how they interacted in the places he had worked before. He processed the scene through his windshield before he got out, which was something his training said to do, and the scene that his windshield showed him was this: a man in a jacket standing several feet from a vehicle with both hands visible at chest height, a couple positioned directly beside the driver's door, the vehicle showing no damage that he could see from this distance, no broken glass, no tool marks, no evidence of forced entry. This did not match his screen. His screen described a suspected vehicle theft in progress, an escalating confrontation, and a possibly armed subject, and the gap between what his screen said and what his eyes were showing him registered somewhere in his awareness, without yet producing a conclusion because he was 8 months into this district, and he had not yet developed the specific confidence required to trust his own observation over the language of a dispatched alert. Sergeant Elena Vargas stepped out of the second vehicle. She was 44 years old, 17 years on the force, and she carried herself with the particular economy of a person who has learned through 17 years of arriving at scenes that other people had described incorrectly, that the first 30 seconds of observation are worth more than the entire prior dispatch call if you know how to use them. Her right hand moved near her holster, not reaching, just resting there. The trained positioning of a field supervisor who is managing an unknown situation and whose body has logged the possibly armed flag, even while her eyes are already running their own assessment. The possibly armed assessment required an actual weapon, or a weapon-shaped object, or a specific motion toward a weapon, or a credible description of any of these things from someone who had actually observed them. What she had was a caller who had told the dispatcher that the subject could be armed, which was not the same thing, though the automated system had treated it as equivalent and had escalated accordingly, and the escalation had reached her screen as a fact rather than a speculation, which was how facts and speculations become indistinguishable when a system processes them the same way. Celeste pointed toward Darius before either officer had taken 3 steps from their vehicles. "That's him," she said, and her voice had the particular quality of controlled urgency, carefully modulated, not screaming, not panicked, just sufficiently alarmed to confirm the picture the officers had already received. He was just reaching inside his coat. Merritt's eyes went to Darius's jacket, not to Celeste's phone. Vargas's eyes went to Darius's hands, not to Celeste's phone. This was the right thing to do. They were watching the person, not the narrative about the person. But they were also watching through the filter of the screen they had just been looking at, which said possibly armed in the space where the word possibly does not always survive the translation into human instinct. Darius did not flinch when the officer's attention landed on him. He had known they were coming since they entered the ramp. He had heard the engine note change as they climbed. He had tracked them in the dark window of his own Escalade, the tinted glass giving him a narrow, angled reflection of the entrance behind him, and he had been ready. "My wallet is inside my jacket," he said, his voice carrying the calm, deliberate precision of a man who has conducted enough high-stakes encounters to know that the first sentences spoken to a responding officer shape the next 15 minutes. "My identification and my badge are beside it. I will follow every instruction you give me. Please tell me before you want me to move." The word badge landed in the space between the four of them, Merritt, Vargas, Darius, and the ambient attention of the small crowd that had begun to assemble on the far walkway. 3 people who had slowed and stopped, and a couple near the restaurant entrance 20 yards away, who were watching with the specific expression of people who want to know how this resolves without being close enough to be involved in it. Vargas noted the word, did not respond to it yet. She was still building her observation. Celeste spoke again from beside the vehicle. He was reaching into his coat. "Right before you got here." He made a threatening gesture. Merritt looked at her, then at Darius, then at the vehicle. "No damage, no tool marks, no broken glass." The door Preston was standing beside appeared entirely undisturbed. Vargas gave the instruction. "Turn around, face the vehicle." Darius turned slowly, the movement deliberate, narrated. He turned his head first, then his shoulders, then his body, keeping his hands visible throughout the entire rotation. The practiced compliance of a man who has spent a career on the other side of these instructions, and who understands with a clarity that is hard to explain to someone who does not carry it, that the speed and visibility of this movement matters in ways that have nothing to do with guilt. In the dark, tinted window of the Escalade, he could see Preston Whitfield step behind the officers as they approached. The man who had placed his hand on the door. The man who had called 911. The man who had described a possibly armed suspect and an escalating confrontation from a spot he had chosen not to leave. Preston was now positioned behind the officers, between them and the direction from which Darius had come, which meant that the officers were between Preston and anything that might be directed at Preston, which was exactly the protection Preston had been looking for when he made the call, and which he had now received at the cost of a sequence of events he had not fully thought through. Darius looked at Preston's reflection in the tinted glass for exactly 1 moment. Then he looked at his own hands raised and visible against the black paint of his own vehicle, and he waited. Hands on the hood. The instruction arrived in Vargas's voice, flat and professional, and Darius complied in a single, continuous movement, raising his hands from chest height and placing them palm down on the Escalade's hood, the metal warm from the afternoon sun. The warmth of it specific and grounding in the way that physical sensation is grounding when everything else about a moment is abstract and wrong. The hood was warm because the engine had been off for almost 3 hours, which meant the warmth was stored heat from the morning drive, and the morning drive had been from the sheriff's office on Court Street to the parking gate that had logged him in at 12:47 p.m., and both of those facts existed in records that were sitting in databases at this very moment, waiting for someone to look at them. He kept his fingers flat and spread. The parking structure ambient noise was particular and specific. Somewhere 2 rows over, a shopping cart wheel had the intermittent squeak of a wheel that needed replacing, and it was audible because the person pushing it had slowed to watch what was happening. From the far end of the level, there was the sound of a child asking a question in the patient, persistent way that children ask questions when they sense that adults are preoccupied, and the sound of an adult giving a quiet, deflecting answer. Distant traffic filtered up from the street level below. The specific audio texture of a Thursday afternoon in a district that closes at 5 and is currently not yet closed. Officer Daniel Merritt moved to pat him down with the careful, methodical quality of someone following a procedure rather than someone operating on urgency, and Darius narrated each point of contact before it happened, a practice that he had taught in training sessions more times than he could count, and that he was now executing from the position he had always described when he taught it, which was the position of someone who does not want to be misread. My wallet is in my right hip pocket. My badge and identification are in my inside left jacket pocket. There is nothing else. Vargas was watching Preston during the pat-down. This was a choice she made and would later document. She shifted her attention to the complainants while her partner handled the subject because she was the field supervisor, and the field supervisor's job in this moment was to build the picture that the dispatch call had not fully provided. What she was building did not align with the dispatch call. No forced entry marks on the door Preston was standing beside, no scratches around the lock cylinder, no damage to the window seals. No broken glass anywhere on the level surface which she could see for 30 feet in either direction because the parking structure's overhead lighting, industrial and unglamorous, illuminated everything without shadow. The vehicle appeared entirely undisturbed. The vehicle appeared to be a vehicle that had been parked here by someone who had a key and then accessed by that person using that key, which was the ordinary and unremarkable story that happened several thousand times a day in parking structures across the country, and that never resulted in a patrol call, except in the specific case where the person with the key looked a particular way in a particular neighborhood, and someone with a phone decided to define the situation before the facts had a chance to. Preston was speaking, filling the space, volunteering details, with the particular energy of a man who can feel a narrative slipping and is working to stabilize it. The signal copying equipment that sophisticated thieves used had the officers heard about this. It was a real issue in premium districts like this one. He had read about it. He had seen it mentioned in a security newsletter that the Caldwell Club distributed to members. He was simply doing what any responsible community member would do when they observed something that seemed inconsistent. Celeste added her layer. The man's demeanor had been so unsettling. She had genuinely felt frightened. They had not been able to leave because the situation was developing so rapidly. Vargas noted that there were 3 open lanes behind the Whitfields. She noted this in her mental record and did not say it aloud because saying it aloud was not yet her job. Her job right now was observation documentation, the assembly of a picture that could be examined later against the picture the dispatch call had provided. Merritt closed the handcuffs. The sound was specific, a sharp click, then a second click, then the mechanical ratcheting of the adjustment. The sound that once you have heard it, applied to your own wrists you carry in your memory differently from how you carry any other sound. Darius did not resist. His shoulders absorbed the movement with the stillness of complete non-resistance, the deliberate absence of any motion that could be interpreted as pushback, a stillness that was not submission, but was its own kind of testimony. The testimony of a man who is making sure that every second of what is happening is on the record exactly as it is happening, with nothing added by either party. He spoke loudly enough for the bystanders on the far walkway to hear him clearly enough for both body cameras to capture cleanly. I am not resisting. I am complying. I have identified myself and my property, and I am complying with every instruction I have received. A new message appeared on Vargas's shoulder radio, surfacing through the ambient traffic of dispatch communications, and Vargas heard the beginning of it clearly: independent witness disputes, and then it disappeared beneath another transmission. Someone calling in a traffic incident 3 blocks south, and the completion of the sentence, the part that specified what the witness had disputed, and on the basis of what observation, was gone before it fully arrived. Merritt had not heard it at all. The key was still lying on the pavement where Darius had placed it, 2 feet from the rear tire, the specific size and shape of a vehicle key, with a black rubber grip, the kind of key that looks exactly like the key to the vehicle it opens, because that is what it was. The Escalade sat unlocked, patient doors still responding to the last instruction the key had given it, waiting with the uncomplicated reliability of a machine that does not have opinions about who it belongs to, only about which key has been paired with its system, and the answer to that question had been determined and logged and documented on the day the key was cut. Preston continued talking. He was explaining now the concept of neighborhood stewardship, the idea that residents of established districts had a responsibility to each other to maintain the standard of the environment, that this was not about any individual, but about the collective integrity of the community, that he was sure the officers understood what he was describing because they were professionals, and professionals understood these things. Vargas noted the open lanes behind him again, noted the absence of forced entry marks, noted the key on the pavement, noted the Escalade unlocked, undamaged patient, wrote nothing yet, observed everything, waited for her partner to complete the search. Merritt's hand moved into Darius's inside left jacket pocket. Vargas separated Vanessa from the gathering crowd before anyone had the opportunity to show her Celeste's video, which was a decision Vargas made without articulating it consciously, but which reflected something her 17 years had taught her about the order in which witnesses should encounter evidence, her own first before anyone else's version of the same events. She walked Vanessa to the monitoring station away from the Whitfield sightline, and she took out her notepad and she listened. Vanessa described the sequence in the precise, compressed language of someone who has spent years making accurate reports under time pressure. Darius crossing the level alone, the vehicle responding to his key, the headlights flashing and the mirrors unfolding, and the door locks releasing before Preston's hand appeared against the door. Preston crossing from the direction of the Caldwell Club entrance and making contact with the driver's door after the vehicle had already responded, the 2 or 3 seconds between the vehicle's response and Preston's arrival at the door being the critical interval that the camera recording had not captured. The parking management system provided the next layer without being asked. Vanessa pulled up the gate log on her tablet and showed Vargas the entry from 12:47 p.m., the Escalade's plate registered to Darius M. Caldwell, Caldwell County, passing through the entrance with no flags, no theft alert, no record of any kind suggesting that this vehicle was anything other than a vehicle being driven by its registered owner into a parking structure. And then Vanessa showed Vargas her own entry, the plate, the timestamp, the notation she had made when the vehicle responded to Darius's key, 3:31 p.m. Preston's 911 call had been logged at 3:33 p.m. The note disputing his account had existed in the system for 2 full minutes before he finished making the call. Vargas looked at the tablet. She looked at the timestamp. She wrote both down in her notepad with the specific, careful handwriting of someone preserving something that might matter. Then Vanessa said the thing that Vargas appreciated her saying because it would have been easier not to say it. "I hesitated," Vanessa said. "When I saw what was happening, I hesitated for maybe 3 minutes before I called it in." She said it with the particular steadiness of someone who has already made their accounting with themselves and is now making it to the relevant authority. The Whitfield name is on 3 active permits in this district. I knew that. And I knew that putting my name in the middle of something involving that name had a certain kind of risk attached to it that calling in an unrelated incident doesn't have. She paused. "I made a different call at the 3-minute mark. I want that to be on the record too." Vargas nodded and wrote it down. She wrote down the hesitation, and she wrote down the choice, and she wrote down the timeline because the timeline was the thing that would matter most in every conversation that followed, not the hesitation, not the choice, not Vanessa's assessment of the risk, but the fact that the note had been in the system before the restraints went on, which meant the information was available, which meant the question to be answered later was not whether the information existed, but whether the responding officers had access to it and acted on it. The answer to that question was in the transmission log, and Vargas requested the complete original dispatch recording right there at the monitoring station, not the summarized alert that had appeared on her screen, but the full audio file with every call, every note, and every transmission timestamp. What came back was different from what she had received in the vehicle. Preston's first call to 911 had described a man who was still there as the evidence of suspicious activity. He had described no weapon. He had described no physical contact. He had described no damage to the vehicle. He had described the presence of someone he believed did not belong, and the automated system had taken his subsequent calls, each one a restatement with minor elaboration, as increasing evidence of danger because the system counted frequency as corroboration, and Preston had called 3 times in 6 minutes. The system did not distinguish between new information and repeated assertion. It distinguished between silence and noise, and Preston had provided consistent noise, and the system had interpreted consistent noise as a consistently escalating threat, which was how a man drinking coffee on his own porch and a man standing in a parking lot with his hands at chest height ended up with possibly armed on the responding officer's screens. Vargas closed her notepad. She looked across the level at Merritt, who was still conducting the search, his hand inside Darius's jacket, and she could see from Merritt's posture the slight forward lean, the particular stillness of someone who has found something and is processing what it means that the contents of that pocket were changing the shape of the next several hours. She walked back across the lane toward them, her stride carrying the specific weight of a person who has just assembled a picture that she cannot unassemble and that has now become her responsibility. She was moving toward the moment that everything turned. Merritt's hand moved through the jacket with the methodical precision of trained procedure, the particular careful quality of a search conducted by someone who is doing it right rather than fast, and his fingers found the wallet first. Standard leather billfold, back left hip, exactly where Darius had said it would be, and then moved to the inside left pocket, the breast pocket of the jacket, and found something heavier than a wallet. Different texture, different weight. The specific, unmistakable density of a credential case. He drew it out slowly. He held it at the level of the parking structure's overhead light, the flat industrial light that illuminated without flattering, and in that light the seal of the Caldwell County Sheriff's Office caught the angle and threw back a precise, gold-edged reflection that was bright enough to see from 6 feet away. Below the seal, a photo identification card laminated official issue bearing a photograph of a man in a dress uniform with the particular composed expression of a professional photograph taken for an identification purpose. And that face was the same face that was currently turned partially toward him, over the shoulder of the man whose hands were on the hood of the vehicle, waiting. The name, printed in block capital letters beneath the photograph, read, Darius M. Caldwell, Sheriff, Caldwell County. Beat 1. Merritt's brain received the image before it processed the meaning the way the brain sometimes does when information arrives in a form that contradicts a frame sufficiently established that the frame takes a moment to release. He stared at the credential case for a full 2 seconds, not blankly, but with the specific, focused attention of someone running the information against everything they have understood about the current situation, finding the mismatch, running it again. Beat 2. He looked up. Darius was already looking at him, had been looking at him the entire time, with an expression that contained no surprise, no triumph, no anger, no vindication, only the flat, patient waiting of a man who has known what was in that pocket, and has been watching the world arrive at the same knowledge he has been carrying since he walked across this parking level an hour and 42 minutes ago. Beat 3. Merritt looked at Vargas, who was walking back from the monitoring station, with her notepad in her hand and an expression that told him she had already assembled a picture he had not yet seen. She covered the distance between them in 5 steps, read the credential case over Merritt's shoulder, read the name, read the title, looked at Darius, and the movement of understanding across her face was quiet and final, the closing of a door rather than the slamming of one. Beat 4. Merritt looked at Preston. Preston was still talking. He had been talking continuously for the better part of 4 minutes, providing elaboration, providing context, providing the kind of ambient explanation that fills silence, when silence is threatening to become clarifying, and in the specific moment that Merritt's eyes found him, Preston had his back half-turned, addressing a point in the middle distance, explaining signal copying technology to no one in particular. He had not yet registered what was in Merritt's hand. Beat 5. The credential case trembled slightly in Merritt's grip, not from fear, but from the specific physical phenomenon of holding something that has just reordered every fact about the last 20 minutes. The slight involuntary motor response of a nervous system that has received information too large for its current framework and is in the process of rebuilding the framework to contain it. Beat 6. Vargas arrived at his shoulder. She looked at the credential. She looked at Darius. She looked at Preston, who had begun to turn back toward the officers, sensing that something in their energy had changed. She said, "Remove the cuffs." And Darius said, "Not yet." The two words landed with a weight that neither officer had expected, because they were the words of a man declining relief. A man who was choosing to remain in the discomfort of the current moment, rather than allow the moment to be resolved before it had been properly witnessed, and the specific quality of that choice, the voluntariness of it, the deliberateness, told both officers something about who they were dealing with that the credential case alone could not have communicated. Both officers looked at him. He spoke from the position of his hands on the hood of his car without turning fully around, his voice calm and unhurried. "Record the time the badge was located," he said. "Record the condition of the restraints. Lock both cameras and preserve the original dispatch recording. Do not release me on the basis of the badge." A beat, and then, "If this vehicle isn't mine, the badge doesn't make it mine. And if it is mine, which it is, then the badge should not have been what was necessary to establish that. I want the record to contain both of those things before these cuffs come off." Vargas wrote the time 3:54 p.m. She noted the restraint condition. She photographed the credential case where Merritt still held it. Preston had turned fully around now, and he was looking at the credential case from a distance of 12 feet, and the sequence of understanding was arriving in him more slowly than it had arrived in the officers, because the officers had been trained to process unexpected information rapidly, and Preston had spent 30 years in an environment where unexpected information was something that happened to other people. He saw the seal. He processed the seal. He saw the name. He processed the name. And something happened behind his eyes that was not quite collapse and not quite comprehension, but was the specific expression of a mind encountering for the first time the particular kind of wrong that cannot be converted into a misunderstanding with the right choice of words. The badge remained in Merritt's hand, catching the parking structure's light. The Escalade remained unlocked behind them, patient unchanged, the key on the pavement where it had been since Darius placed it there, waiting for the world to catch up to what the key had already known. The recognition arrived in Preston Whitfield in stages, which was worse in its way than arriving all at once, because the stages gave him time to watch himself understand what he had done, without being able to stop the understanding from completing. He saw the sheriff's seal, first gold, and detailed the kind of seal you see on official correspondence and county vehicles and the front door of public buildings. The seal that means something specific and institutional, and his brain registered it as an object before it registered it as a fact. Then he saw the photograph on the ID card beside it, the formal photograph, the dress uniform, the composed, professional expression, and he matched the face in the photograph to the face attached to the hands that were on the hood of that vehicle, and the match was immediate and inescapable, the way a match always is once you are actually looking. Then he read the name. Darius M. Caldwell, Sheriff, Caldwell County. For 3 seconds, Preston Whitfield stood completely still, which was notable because Preston Whitfield was not a man who stood still. He was a man who moved through situations, who managed them, who found the angle that allowed him to exit in the direction he had intended to go. And the 3 seconds of stillness were the specific stillness of a man whose management strategies had run out at the same time. Then the recalibration began, because Preston's survival instinct was faster than his conscience, and survival required a second version of the story before the first version fully collapsed. "I want to be clear," he said, and the sentence arrived in the smoothed-out register of a man who has had a great deal of practice beginning conversations in which he needs to reframe what has just been established. "I wasn't certain whose vehicle this was. I acted out of an abundance of caution based on what I was observing in context." Vargas turned to face him fully. "Can you describe what you observed that led you to believe a theft was occurring?" Preston's answer began with the signal copying technology moved to a passing resemblance to a vehicle owned by someone he knew and arrived at the general principle of security consciousness in premium districts, each component moving slightly further from anything he had actually observed and slightly closer to the language of principled concern, rather than the language of a man who had placed his hand on someone else's car door and called 911 3 times in 6 minutes. "Did you observe him using any tools or devices to access the vehicle?" Vargas asked. "Not specifically, but did you observe any damage to the vehicle? Scratches, broken glass marks on the door or lock he could have? Did the vehicle respond to the key in his hand before or after you placed your hand on the driver's door?" The silence that followed that question was of a particular and damning quality. The silence not of someone thinking through an answer, but of someone discovering that the answer they need does not exist in the sequence of events as they actually occurred. Celeste spoke because she had spent 22 years providing the register that Preston's flat authority lacked, and she provided it now from a position that was considerably less stable than it had been 6 minutes ago. "We were just trying to protect the neighborhood," she said. The phrase, which had served her well in the contexts of the Architectural Heritage Council and the non-emergency line, and the 2 prior calls she had made about people who turned out to be doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing, landed differently in a parking structure where the badge of the county sheriff was sitting in a patrol officer's hand. Protecting the neighborhood from the county sheriff, on the county sheriff's own property, while he stood with his hands on the hood of his own vehicle, handcuffed. Merritt had been looking at Darius during the exchange, and he had made a decision in the way that young officers sometimes make decisions, not from policy or procedure, but from the sudden, clear-cut certainty that a thing is simply wrong, and he picked up his camera and photographed the cuff marks on Darius's wrists before anyone told him to. The marks were a deep, vivid red against the skin, the kind of marks that handcuffs leave when they have been worn for more than a few minutes, the kind of marks that have a timestamp attached to them by virtue of existing, the kind of marks that tell you precisely how long a man was restrained, regardless of what the report says about the duration. Merritt had applied those cuffs, and the marks were his documentation of his own action, and he photographed them with the particular care of someone who understands that this photograph is going to matter in a context he cannot yet fully see. Vargas gave the instruction to release the restraints. The cuffs came off. Darius did not rub his wrists. His hands dropped to his sides and stayed there, visible still, and he allowed Vargas to photograph the marks without reaching toward the camera or adjusting his position, because the marks needed to be photographed exactly as they were, in the exact light of the exact parking structure at the exact time, and he was not going to move his hands in a way that made that harder. Then he crouched and picked up the key from the pavement. The key that had unlocked the vehicle. The key that had caused the headlights to flash and the mirrors to unfold and the door locks to release before Preston's hand appeared against the door. The key that had been logged in the gate system at 12:47 p.m. and whose paired relationship with this vehicle was documented in the encrypted delivery record from the dealership on the day it was cut. He held it in his palm for a moment, the familiar weight of it, and then he closed his hand around it and put it in his pocket. He looked at Preston once, directly, for long enough that the looking was its own kind of statement, not a threat, not a judgment, just the specific, steady attention of a man who has made sure that everything he needs is on the record, and who has nothing remaining to prove. Preston received the look with the expression of a man who has arrived at the far end of a situation that he began with complete confidence and is now discovering that confidence and accuracy are not the same thing, and that the difference matters considerably when the other party has a 30-year career and a credential case and a parking gate log and a witness with a timestamp. He looked away first. Celeste had lowered her phone, finally, for only the second time since the confrontation began. The recording was still running. It was just no longer serving the purpose she had intended when she started it. What Darius said next was the thing that would be noted later in the investigation, and the proceedings, and the eventual reform documents, as the detail that distinguished his conduct from every other person's conduct at the scene. And it was this. He removed himself from the investigation entirely, before anyone thought to ask him whether he should. He addressed Vargas directly, standing beside his own vehicle, cuff marks still visible on his wrists, the credential case back in his pocket, the key that had started all of this now back in the same pocket that had held the key when he walked across this level at 3:29 p.m. "I am the complainant in this matter," he said, "not the investigating authority. I want to be clear about that now before anything else happens. I will not be directing this inquiry. I will not be using my office to influence the outcome. I will receive updates through the same channels that any complainant uses, and I will not seek preferential access to the case record because of my position." He paused. "I have one instruction, and it is not an instruction that comes from my office. It's a request that any complainant would be entitled to make. Preserve everything. The original dispatch recording, not the summarized alert, the parking gate log, the timestamp on the witness note, both body cameras locked as of right now, and the specific timestamp on when the badge was located relative to when the restraints were applied." Vargas confirmed each item as he named it, writing them in her notepad in the order he gave them, the way you write down things that are going to matter. Preston made one more attempt before the officers fully turned their attention away from him, the last attempt of a man trying to locate an angle that still works. "I'd like to speak with whoever is in charge here," he said, and the specific phrasing of it, "whoever is in charge here," carried an implicit assumption that was audible to anyone listening. The assumption that the person in charge would be someone other than Darius, would be someone that Preston could appeal to through the informal channels that had always been available to Preston, the channels that ran through relationships and fundraisers and the kind of reciprocal recognition that operates between people who have always been in the room together. Vargas looked at him with the flat professional patience of someone who has been in uniform for 17 years and has heard this particular request in many variations. "The senior officer present is me, sir," she said. "And right now I need you to remain where you are." Preston remained where he was. Merritt stayed at the scene to complete his initial observation notes, and he made a choice that he would later document in his own report without editorializing. He decided to write the notes from his direct observation rather than from the dispatch summary, which meant he was writing what his eyes had seen in the 37 minutes since his vehicle entered the ramp, not what his screen had told him to expect. He documented no forced entry marks on any surface of the vehicle, no damage, no broken glass, no tool marks on the lock cylinder. He documented the vehicle's doors were in the unlocked position when he arrived. He documented the key matching the vehicle was located on the pavement in plain sight. He documented the search of the subject's person revealed a county sheriff's credential case in the inside breast pocket of his jacket. And then he documented the thing that was hardest to write. The thing that required him to sit with his own actions for a moment before putting them in the record. He documented restraints were applied before ownership of the vehicle was verified, and before the contradictory information already existing in the dispatch record had been transmitted to the responding officers or confirmed on scene. He did not add a sentence explaining this. He did not add a sentence contextualizing it. He wrote what had happened, and he wrote it accurately, because accurate reports are what reports are for, and because the alternative, the kind of report that smooths the uncomfortable edges, that adopts the language of the dispatch call rather than the language of what he had directly observed, was the kind of report that allowed the same thing to happen again the next time, to someone who did not have a credential case in their inside pocket. Darius drove out of Riverstone Commons at 4:11 p.m., the same key, the same vehicle, the same road from the same parking structure, through the gate that logged his exit at 4:11 p.m., just as it had logged his entrance at 12:47 p.m., adding a second timestamp to the record of an ordinary man doing an ordinary thing that had become, in the hours between those two timestamps, something considerably less ordinary. He did not play the radio. He drove in the specific silence of a man who has been through something and is not yet ready to convert it into narrative, who is still in the middle of it even as the parking structure recedes in his mirrors, who knows that what comes next is going to be long and procedural and important, and who needs the drive home to exist in the space before the long and procedural and important begins. In the parking structure behind him, Preston stood on the curb beside the vehicle he had blocked and watched the Escalade's taillights turn out of the second level toward the exit ramp. Beside him, Celeste said nothing. The key on the pavement was gone. The Escalade was gone. The cuff marks on Darius's wrists had been photographed and logged. The record was already assembling itself around what had happened, the way records do when the right people make the decision to write down what they actually saw. And for the first time in a very long time, Preston Whitfield was standing in a situation he had not defined and could not redefine, and could not call someone to make disappear. He didn't know that yet. but the next 48 hours were going to make it clear. Preston did not go home. He went back to the Caldwell Club, which was what he did when he needed to restore his sense of the world's correct proportions, and he took a corner table in the lounge and ordered something from the bar and sat in the particular quiet of an establishment that had been designed from the foundation up to communicate to everyone inside it that they were exactly where they were supposed to be, which was the feeling Preston needed most right now, and which the room was providing with its usual reliability. He made the call at 4:47 p.m. Deputy Chief Howard Greer was at his weekend property in the Shenandoah Valley, a property that Preston had visited once, 3 years ago, for a dinner that had been categorized on 2 different expense reports as a business development meeting, and he answered on the third ring with the somewhat distracted quality of a man who has been doing something that does not require concentration and is now being asked to concentrate. Preston told him what had happened. He told it the way he told things, which was as a story in which he was the protagonist, making reasonable decisions in a confusing situation, rather than a story in which he was the man who had called 911 3 times and described a county sheriff as a potentially armed vehicle thief. He described the officer who had overreacted, the black man who had turned out to have some kind of credentials that created confusion, the general messiness of the situation. "Can you take a look at the file?" he asked. "See if there's a way to get this filed correctly?" Greer did not ask what credentials the man had. He asked which department had logged the incident. When Preston gave him the district number for Caldwell PD, Greer was quiet for 3 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than his conversational pauses usually ran. And in those 3 seconds, he was running the name Darius Caldwell through his professional memory and landing on it with the specific clarity that you land on something you should have anticipated and didn't. He told Preston he would look into it. He did not tell Preston what he had just understood. He ended the call and he accessed the incident file at 5:28 p.m. from his personal device from the Shenandoah Valley property, using his department credentials, which the system logged automatically, and which he did not know the system logged automatically, because the automatic logging of off-duty access from personal devices had been implemented as part of a data security update 14 months ago, and Greer had not been paying close attention to the security update memo. He looked at the file for 11 minutes. He saw Vanessa's timestamp. He saw the gate log. He saw Merritt's observation notes, which were unusually detailed and which documented the absence of evidence in a way that was going to be difficult to argue with later. He saw the flag on Preston's account, the automated notation that the dispatch record contained contradictory information from an independent witness. That flag was the problem. As long as that flag existed in the active file, the incident was classified as a civil rights complaint with a credible, contradictory account, which meant it sat in a category that required independent review rather than the more manageable category of disputed vehicle identification, which was a category that could be resolved administratively without requiring an independent investigation. At 5:39 p.m., Greer submitted a reclassification request. The proposed reclassification would have moved the incident from civil rights complaint to disputed vehicle identification, and it would have removed the flag noting that Preston's account was contradicted by the independent witness statement. The system rejected the reclassification automatically. The file had been locked by Vargas at 4:23 p.m. under the complaint classification because the complaint involved a law enforcement officer, and complaints involving law enforcement officers at the scene required a supervisor lock pending independent review, which was a procedure that Vargas had followed correctly, and which meant that no reclassification was possible without the approval of an independent reviewing authority. The rejection was logged. The attempted reclassification was time-stamped. The system flagged the off-duty access from a personal device for supervisor review, which was a notification that appeared in the inbox of Greer's own supervisor at 5:41 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, which was 2 minutes after Greer had finished trying to alter a file he had not been assigned to. Greer called Preston back at 5:55 p.m. and told him the situation was more complicated than anticipated. Preston in the lounge of the Caldwell Club, with the room's careful proportions still providing their reassurance around him, experienced the specific sensation of a man who has always had access to a back channel, discovering that the back channel has a door on it that is currently closed. He ordered another drink. He told himself it would work out. He had always told himself that situations worked out, and they always had because he had always had the right relationships in the right places to make them work out, and he still had those relationships, and this was a temporary complication that the relationships would resolve. The system log at Caldwell PD showed 4 entries from that evening: Vargas's lock at 4:23, Greer's access at 5:28, Greer's reclassification attempt at 5:39, and the system's rejection at 5:39 with the automatic flag sent to Greer's supervisor 2 minutes later. 4 entries, 4 timestamps, sitting in a database, waiting for the right person to look at them. Claire Benton had been Caldwell's city administrator and legal counsel for 14 years, which meant she had spent 14 years navigating the specific terrain of a mid-sized Virginia city where the exercise of power was rarely explicit and consequence was rarer still, where things happened through adjacency and implication and the informal relationships between people who had known each other long enough to operate in the grammar of mutual understanding rather than direct instruction. She understood this terrain the way you understand something you have worked in for a long time, not with admiration, but with precision. The precise awareness of someone who knows exactly where the invisible walls are and what it costs to walk into one. She was at her desk at 8:15 on Friday morning when her deputy placed a printout on her desk and said, "You need to see this before anyone else decides they need to see it first." The printout showed Greer's access log from the previous evening. She read it twice the way she read things that were going to require her to do something specific and consequential. She put her reading glasses on the desk, which was something she did when she had finished reading something and was now thinking about it, and she called the Independent Records Unit and told them she was coming in. By noon, she was in the evidence room with the original file materials spread on the metal table under the flat, unambiguous light that evidence rooms always have, as though the light itself is designed to make everything visible without the possibility of a flattering angle, and she gave the instruction that governed every decision that followed. Nothing leaves this room under the control of any person connected to either the Caldwell PD administration or to Whitfield Development Group or to anyone whose name appears in the file as a complainant, respondent, or person of interest. Then she read the file. The 4 timestamps were what told the story, and they told it in the particular economy of timestamps which have no adjectives, no context, no spin, only the recorded fact of when something occurred relative to when something else occurred. At 3:31 p.m., Vanessa records the plate and documents the vehicle response. At 3:33 p.m., Preston calls 911 and begins constructing an account of a man stealing a vehicle he has just watched that man unlock with a key. At 3:51 p.m., Darius is restrained, at which point the contradictory witness note has been in the system for 20 minutes and has not been transmitted to the officers on scene. At 5:39 p.m., a deputy chief, accessing the file from a personal device while off duty, attempts to remove the notation flagging Preston's account as contradictory. Claire looked at the 4 timestamps for a long time. Then she looked at the space between the 3rd and 4th one, specifically at the 108-minute gap between the moment a county sheriff was handcuffed on the basis of an account already contradicted in the system record and the moment a police administrator tried to remove the evidence of that contradiction, and she thought about what that gap meant in terms of what a person would have needed to know to take that action that quickly after the incident, and she called Special Prosecutor Naomi Price. Naomi Price was 52 years old and had been handling cases involving law enforcement misconduct in Caldwell for 9 years, and she had the particular quality of stillness that comes from spending 9 years in rooms where raising your voice would be a mistake. The stillness of someone who has learned that the record does more damage to the people who deserve to be damaged by it than anything she could say. She arrived in the evidence room at 2 in the afternoon. She looked at the 4 timestamps. She looked at the reclassification request. She looked at the specific line Greer had attempted to remove the notation flagging Preston's account as contradictory on the basis of the independent witness statement, and she noted that this was not an editorial line, not a subjective assessment, but a procedural flag generated automatically by the system when a witness account contradicted a caller account in an active file. The line was not wrong. It was not biased. It was a factual notation of the existence of a discrepancy. Removing it was not a correction. It was a concealment. Claire placed Greer's access log under legal hold before she left the evidence room that afternoon, which meant that the log and every record associated with it was now secured against modification, deletion, or reclassification by anyone within the department's administrative structure. The hold was time-stamped at 3:47 p.m. on Friday, approximately 22 hours after the incident. Everything that needed to be preserved was now preserved. Everything that had been attempted was now documented. The record was complete, and it was sealed, and it said exactly what it said. Celeste posted at 6:47 on Friday evening, which was just late enough to catch the end of the news cycle and early enough to carry into the weekend, and she had thought about the timing the way she thought about most things she put into public spaces, which was with the instincts of someone who had run a non-profit advocacy organization and understood the relationship between when you release a story and how much room it has to breathe before anyone contradicts it. The post described what she framed as an assault on their safety and their right to act as responsible community members, and it described Darius without naming him, but with enough specificity about his credentials and his demeanor that identifying him would not be difficult for anyone who was paying attention, as a man who had used his position to intimidate private citizens after being correctly identified as suspicious, and it announced her intention to publish the full recording within the next 24 hours to show the community what had actually happened. Darius learned about the post at 9 that evening when his deputy called him on his personal phone. He sat with it for a moment, the specific quality of sitting with something that has the potential to reframe a narrative that you know to be inaccurate. And then he gave one instruction. "Don't suppress it," he said. "Place whatever she releases beside the full parking camera footage for that level and the complete original 911 call. All three together. Any outlet that runs her video gets the other two alongside it." He did not appear on camera. He did not issue a statement. He did not call a press conference or contact a reporter or reach out to anyone in his network to manage the story, because managing the story was not the same as telling it, and telling it was what the record was for. Claire filed for legal preservation of all digital evidence before 7 the following morning, which meant the original recording was locked before Celeste could release an edited version, and the preservation order required that any public distribution be accompanied by the original, unedited file on request from any media outlet that asked. Naomi Price reviewed Celeste's post against the preserved evidence that same morning and identified 4 specific factual claims in the text that were directly contradicted by time-stamped records, and she added them to the growing document she was compiling about the gap between what the Whitfields had said and what the evidence showed. The investigation did not announce itself. It did not hold a press conference. It did not issue statements or reach out to media. It simply continued accumulating the way thorough investigations do, one verified fact added to another verified fact added to another, until the structure built from those facts was solid enough to hold everything that needed to be placed on top of it. Vanessa saw the post at 10 o'clock that night. She was at her kitchen table and she read Celeste's description of events, the same events Vanessa had watched from 30 feet away with an unobstructed sightline on a Thursday afternoon, and the description bore approximately the same relationship to what had happened as a reflection in water bears to the thing it reflects. The right general shapes, everything important slightly distorted, the distortion sufficient to make the reflection feel like an accurate image if you have not seen the original. She put her phone face down on the table. Then she picked it up again and called the independent records line, the number she had been given by Vargas after her statement at the monitoring station, and she asked whether her statement had been preserved and whether the timestamp on her note was part of the preserved file. The operator confirmed yes in full with complete timestamp under legal hold as of 3:47 that afternoon. Vanessa thanked her and ended the call and sat for a moment in her kitchen with her hands flat on the table, not from distress, but from the specific steadying sensation of knowing that the thing she had said was in a place where it would still be the thing she had said when it mattered. where it had not been shaped or summarized or filed under the wrong heading or buried in a secondary notes queue where it simply existed as a record of what she saw at 3:31 on a Thursday afternoon in the clear, unambiguous light of a parking structure from 30 feet away with an unobstructed sightline. She breathed. For the first time since the hesitation in the parking lot, she breathed with something that was not uncertainty. Naomi Price did not work dramatically. She did not pace or make inspired leaps or have revelations in the middle of the night that sent her to the whiteboard at 3 in the morning with a marker. She worked the way people who are very good at finding things work, which is methodically and without announcement, adding one verified fact to the next verified fact in a sequence that builds its own logic from the ground up, rather than arriving at a conclusion first and working backward. She printed the 4 timestamps and pinned them to the board in her office in the specific order they had occurred, and she looked at them as a sequence rather than as individual facts, because sequences tell stories that individual facts do not, and the story this sequence told was audible without commentary. A witness account contradicting the caller's version had existed in the system for 20 minutes before the restraints were applied. A police administrator had accessed the file while off duty and attempted to remove the flag documenting the contradiction. He had done this within 2 hours of the incident. Before he had watched the body camera footage, before he had reviewed the parking gate log, before he had done anything that would constitute a reasonable basis for knowing which specific line in the file was the one that created the most risk for the person who had called him from the lounge of the Caldwell Club. Naomi drafted one question and submitted it to Greer's attorney in writing as a formal inquiry. Deputy Chief Greer accessed the incident file at 5:28 p.m. and submitted a reclassification request at 5:39 p.m. that specifically proposed removing the notation flagging the caller's account as contradicted by an independent witness. Please explain how Deputy Chief Greer identified this specific notation as the target of the reclassification request before reviewing the body camera footage, the parking gate log, or the full dispatch recording. She gave his attorney 48 hours to respond. The response arrived in 36 hours and did not address the question. It addressed jurisdiction and procedural standing and the appropriate scope of independent prosecution authority, and it argued that the reclassification request had been an administrative action within the deputy chief's normal operational scope, and it did not contain a single sentence that explained how Greer had known which line needed to disappear. The non-answer went into the record. The system log answered the question anyway. Naomi then turned to the Greer-Whitfield relationship, which she reconstructed through campaign finance disclosures, procurement records, and the access logs associated with 3 prior incident files involving Whitfield Development Group properties over the preceding 4 years. What she found was not dramatic in any single instance, but was unmistakable as a pattern. 3 prior incidents. 3 prior cases in which a file had been accessed by Greer within 48 hours of a call from a Whitfield business contact. 3 prior cases in which the classification had subsequently been adjusted in a direction that was favorable to Whitfield's interests. 3 prior cases in which no documentation existed for the basis of the reclassification, which was itself a procedural violation, because reclassifications were required to be documented with a stated rationale. The rationale fields in all 3 cases were blank. 2 of those 3 cases had involved black residents of the East Side who had filed complaints about construction noise and property access violations connected to Whitfield Development Group projects. In both cases, the residents' complaints had been reclassified as nuisance reports within 72 hours of filing, which moved them into a category that required no investigation and no response, and which they would never have known about unless they had specifically requested their file and known to look at the classification field. Neither resident had known to look. Naomi added a second board to her office wall, a 6-year timeline of Greer's access history, overlaid with the timeline of Whitfield's active complaints, disputes, and permit applications that had required any interaction with city or county authority. The overlay was not subtle. She did not accuse Greer of accepting money. She did not need to, and more importantly, she did not have evidence of that, and she was not in the business of assertions she could not support. What she had was the documented pattern of access and adjustment, and the pattern served as its own argument, because a pattern that consistently produces the same outcome in favor of the same party is indistinguishable from an evidentiary standpoint from an arrangement designed to produce that outcome. And the distinction between the two is one for a jury to make, rather than a prosecutor to claim. She submitted her preliminary findings to Claire on Monday morning, 9 days after the parking lot. She included a recommendation that all prior cases involving both Greer's Access ID and any Whitfield-connected complaint be flagged for independent review under objective criteria, which meant looking at those cases not with the question of whether Greer had done something wrong, but with the question of whether the outcomes in those cases were consistent with the evidence they contained. For 2 of the cases, the answer to that question was going to produce results that the original complainants had waited 6 years to receive. The administrative hearing was held in a conference room on the 4th floor of the city attorney's office, which was a room designed for exactly this kind of purpose. A long table, 7 chairs, a recording device, good light, and the specific impersonality of a room where consequential things happen without the dramatic architecture of a courtroom, because consequential things that happen in conference rooms are often more consequential than the ones that happen in courtrooms, because conference rooms do not have audiences and therefore do not allow the parties to perform for anyone. Greer arrived with his attorney, a man named Philip Carver, who wore expensive shoes and spoke with the particular precision of someone who had spent a career finding the argument that wasn't there. The procedural objection that created just enough space between a fact and its interpretation to allow something to slip through. Carver's strategy was clear from his opening statement. The reclassification request had been an ordinary administrative action. The off-duty access had been motivated by the deputy chief's good faith desire to assist in the resolution of a case that had potential political sensitivity, and there was no documented evidence of a direct arrangement between Greer and any private party that would constitute the kind of misconduct that the independent prosecutor's mandate required her to demonstrate. He used the word misunderstanding in his first 3 sentences. Naomi let him finish. Then she placed the printed timestamp board on the conference table and asked the 3 members of the disciplinary review board to note the sequence which she read aloud once without inflection in the order the events had occurred. Then she placed Greer's written response to her question on the table beside the timestamp board and read the question aloud. How did Deputy Chief Greer identify the specific notation as the target of the reclassification request before reviewing any of the evidence materials in the file? Then she read the response, which was 3 paragraphs about jurisdiction and scope, and did not contain an answer to the question. Then she turned the access log monitor toward Greer and his attorney and asked them both to note the timestamp on the reclassification request relative to the timestamp on Greer's access, which showed that Greer had been in the file for 11 minutes before submitting the request, and she asked them to consider what a person could have reviewed in 11 minutes that would have led them directly to one specific notational flag in a complex incident file. Philip Carver said, "I'd like to request a brief recess." The review board granted 15 minutes. During the 15 minutes, Naomi sat at the table and reviewed her notes. She had not raised her voice once in the preceding 40 minutes. She had not made an accusation. She had not argued with Carver's framing or challenged his characterization of the access as good faith. She had placed documents on a table and asked that the sequence be noted, and the sequence had done everything that needed to be done. When Carver and Greer returned, Carver informed the panel that his client had elected to submit his resignation, effective immediately, and would cooperate with any further investigative review as requested. The union representative, who had been sitting at the end of the table without contributing to the proceedings, closed his notebook. He had opened it at the beginning of the hearing and had been writing in it for the first 20 minutes in the way that union representatives write notes when they are considering what arguments to make in defense of a member. At some point in the preceding 20 minutes, he had stopped writing. The closed notebook was its own kind of statement. Naomi thanked the panel and the court reporter and asked for confirmation that the recording was complete, and then she left the timestamp board on the table because it was a document in the official record, and documents in the official record stayed with the record. She walked down the 4 flights of stairs rather than taking the elevator, which was something she did when she needed a few minutes to transition from the inside of a proceeding to the outside of one. And by the time she reached the lobby, her face had the particular quality of someone who has completed a piece of work and is already thinking about the next one. Outside, the October light was the same low amber quality it had been 2 weeks ago in the parking structure, the same angle, the same warmth, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment in it before walking to her car. The criminal proceedings were handled by the county district attorney, and the first thing the district attorney's office did before any of the proceedings began was formally note for the record that the county sheriff had recused himself from any connection to the prosecution and would be receiving case updates only as a complainant through the same channels available to any member of the public. This was noted because it needed to be noted, and it was the kind of fact that looks small in a document but carries significant weight in context, because the alternative, a sheriff with his own credential case and his own 33-year career directing the prosecution of the people who had caused him to be handcuffed in a parking structure, would have been a different kind of story altogether, and not a better one. Preston's defense went through 3 positions across 2 pretrial hearings. The first position was that the event had been a good-faith public safety concern, a reasonable response to an ambiguous situation by a community member who takes neighborhood security seriously. The second position introduced after the timestamp board had been filed with the court was that the vehicle identification had been genuinely ambiguous, and that the electronic response to the key was not conclusive proof of ownership. The third position introduced after the parking gate log and the delivery certificate and the encrypted key pairing record had all been submitted was that Preston's relationship with former Deputy Chief Greer had been entirely unrelated to the parking lot incident and should not be considered in the present proceedings. Each position was met with the same response from the district attorney's office, the timestamps. Preston pleaded guilty. He admitted to knowingly filing a false emergency report, providing false information to law enforcement officers, and interfering with the lawful property access of Darius M. Caldwell. The court imposed restitution, 300 hours of community service to be performed in the East Caldwell district, the east side, the neighborhood where Darius had grown up, where Robert Caldwell had worked the overnight shift, and where Gloria still lived on Meridian Street, and a 3-year supervised probation that included a formal prohibition against contacting or retaliating against Vanessa Okafor in any form. Celeste entered a plea of responsibility for giving investigators a materially false statement. A civil consent order required her to remove the edited recording from every platform where it had been distributed to preserve the original unedited file under independent custody, and to publish the official correction in every digital space where she had distributed the original accusation, with the same prominence and in the same format. The correction included the opening sequence that her recording had not captured the vehicle's headlights flashing, the mirrors unfolding, the door locks releasing in response to Darius's key, the full 2 seconds of the vehicle responding before any other person's hand appeared in the frame. The Caldwell Architectural Heritage Council, 3 board members submitted their resignations within a week of the consent order becoming public record, and the nonprofit suspended all operations pending a governance review that was for the purposes of the nonprofit's ongoing mission, likely to be thorough. The procurement audit of Whitfield Development Group found 6 instances across 4 years in which Preston had used Greer as an undisclosed police contact during disputes connected to municipal projects, and 2 of those instances involved the reclassification of complaints from Black Eastside residents who had filed legitimate grievances about construction activity on Whitfield properties. The procurement board canceled all pending bids, imposed a 5-year bar on new contracts, and placed 3 existing contracts under independent compliance review. The 2 Eastside residents whose complaint files had been reclassified were notified that their original filings were being reopened for review under objective criteria. Both had been waiting for 6 years. Preston signed the plea agreement in a room with no cameras and no reporters and no colleagues from the Caldwell Club, which was the condition that formal legal proceedings create when everyone who would otherwise be present has decided to be unavailable. He looked at the pen in his hand for a moment before writing his name, the specific hesitation of a man holding the instrument of his own accounting. And then he wrote it because the record required it. And the record, as it turned out, had never cared very much about what Preston Whitfield preferred. The review board examined Merritt and Vargas separately, the way consequential reviews examine people who were together at the scene, because separating them produces two independent accounts that can then be compared against each other and against the physical evidence and the documented record. And the comparison is where the truth of what happened becomes findable, regardless of what any individual says. The accounts matched. Not in the way that coordinated accounts match with identical phrasing and the specific smoothness of people who have rehearsed a common story, but in the way that honest accounts of the same event match with the small variations in detail and emphasis that come from two people observing the same thing from slightly different angles, and with a shared core that was inescapable because it was simply what had happened. Merritt's report was the one that the review board returned to most often. It was unusually specific, and it was specific in the direction of his own conduct rather than in the direction of justifying it, which is what distinguishes a genuinely honest report from a strategically honest one. He documented that his screen had described a possibly armed subject and that this description had shaped his initial response before he had an opportunity to conduct his own observation, and that his own observation, had he relied on it rather than the dispatch summary, would have produced a different initial assessment. He documented that he had applied the restraints before verifying ownership of the vehicle, before examining the physical evidence that would have established or contradicted the reported theft, and before transmitting or receiving the contradictory witness account that had been in the system since before he entered the parking structure. He documented that he had not asked Preston Whitfield what specific evidence connected the reported individual to the vehicle. He documented all of this without a sentence of self-justification, which was either unusual courage or simple professional integrity, and the review board's report would eventually describe it as both. The discipline was real. Merritt was removed from armed response duty pending successful completion of a comprehensive retraining program and an independent performance review, and the review was specific, not a rubber stamp, not a waiting period, but an actual assessment of whether his judgment in high-pressure situations with ambiguous information had developed sufficiently to warrant restored authority. Vargas temporarily lost field supervision authority for allowing the detention to continue after the physical evidence at the scene had failed to match the dispatch alert, and for not transmitting the contradictory witness information to Merritt before the restraints were applied. Her report, like Merritt's, acknowledged the failure without minimizing it. She wrote, "The armed subject notation on my screen continued to influence my threat assessment after my direct observation had produced evidence inconsistent with the reported theft. I did not update my threat assessment on the basis of my direct observation as quickly as the physical evidence required." She did not write that the situation was confusing or that the dispatch system had set her up to fail or that any reasonable officer would have made the same call. She wrote what she had done, and she wrote what the evidence showed she should have done differently, because that was what the report was for. The dispatch system reform that came from those two reports was the most consequential outcome of the entire sequence of events, though it would take 18 months and a separate policy process to implement it fully. A weapons claim would henceforth be marked as unverified in the active case display unless the caller described a specific, observable object or action, not a speculation, not a possibility, but a description of something actually seen. Contradictory witness information from facility personnel would be transmitted to responding officers immediately, rather than stored in a secondary notes queue where it might or might not surface before the interaction resolved. For reports involving a stationary vehicle and no immediate physical threat, officers would be required to check the plate, the theft status, and the registration record before applying restraints. Darius was not involved in designing the reform. He was not consulted as the county sheriff. He submitted his perspective as a complainant through the same written process available to any member of the public, and his submission was included in the policy development record alongside the submissions of Vanessa Okafor, the two East Side residents whose complaints had been reclassified by Greer, and 14 other individuals who had responded to the public comment period. His submission was 6 paragraphs long and contained no reference to his position and no request for any specific outcome. It described what had happened from the position of someone standing in a parking lot with his hands at chest height, and it described what the gap between the information in the dispatch system and the information transmitted to the responding officers had cost him, measured in the specific weight of handcuff marks on his wrists, and the 37 minutes between the time he pressed his key and the time he drove out of the parking structure. He wanted the record to contain all of that. It did. The formal exoneration arrived through the same channels that Celeste's post had traveled, which was a specific kind of justice, not symmetrical in its satisfactions, but appropriate in its geography, the correction appearing in the same spaces where the accusation had lived, wearing the same prominence, carrying the same access to the same audiences. The exoneration stated in the plain language that official documents sometimes manage to achieve that no theft had occurred, that no threatening conduct had been observed, that the restraints had been applied before ownership had been verified and before the contradictory witness information had been transmitted to the responding officers, and that the subject of the incident had been Darius M. Caldwell, sheriff of Caldwell County, whose right to access his own registered vehicle had been unlawfully interrupted for 37 minutes on the basis of a complaint that the physical evidence did not support. Every agency that had received any version of the original incident received the correction. Every database that had attached any flag to Darius's name or license plate was updated under independent supervision, the attempted theft notation removed, the subject alert removed, the armed person flag removed, each one formally cleared, the clearance itself time-stamped and logged so that the clearing of the record was itself part of the record and could not later be undone without producing its own timestamp. The parking gate log was archived as a permanent part of the case file, which meant that the entry at 12:47 p.m. Caldwell DM, registered owner, no flags, no alerts, would exist in the record of that incident for as long as the record existed, a quiet and permanent refutation of the story that had been built around it. The exoneration letter arrived at Darius's office on a Wednesday afternoon. He read it at his desk, standing rather than sitting, because he had been sitting all morning, and his back was reminding him that 57 has different requirements than 47, and he read it twice. And then he set it face down on the desk and returned to the 3 other documents he had been working through before it arrived, because the work of the office did not pause for the private moments of the person who ran it. Gloria called that evening. She had seen a segment on the local news, not the main story, a brief item, the kind of follow-up that a story gets when the outcome has been determined and the narrative need is for closure rather than drama, and she asked whether he was all right, which was the question she had been asking him since he was 8 years old and had come home with his knee torn open from a fall on the Meridian Street sidewalk, and which had never changed its essential meaning, regardless of what the specific thing was that had happened. He told her he was fine. She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a woman who is deciding whether to say the thing she is thinking. Then she said, "Your daddy would have been so angry." He said, "I know." She said, "And then after he finished being angry, he would have been so proud." He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I know that too, Mama." He did not tell her what he had done on the afternoon he drove out of Riverstone Commons, though he thought about telling her, and decided against it because it was a thing that belonged to him and to the particular private accounting of a man who has been through something and needs to sit with it before he describes it to anyone, even someone he loves. What he had done was this. He had pulled out of the parking structure and driven 3 blocks south and pulled into the lot of a gas station that had been on that corner since he was in the academy. The same gas station where he had stopped once or twice a month for 30 years without ever thinking about it as anything other than a gas station on a corner, and he had sat in the Escalade with the engine running and his hands on the wheel and the obsidian hood in front of him in the late afternoon light. And he had sat there for approximately 4 minutes without doing anything specific. Not from distress. Not from the need to recover or compose himself. From the particular necessity of being present in a moment that had cost something to get through, because moments that cost something to get through deserve to be inhabited rather than driven past, and he had spent 33 years learning the difference between acknowledging what a thing cost and being defeated by what it cost, and the sitting was the acknowledgement. 4 minutes. Then he put the car in gear and pulled back onto the road and drove home because there was work to do in the morning, and Gloria had made him promise to call on Sunday, and his report to the County Oversight Board was due by end of week. The cost was acknowledged. The work continued. That was the agreement he had made with himself a very long time ago, and he had not found a reason to renegotiate it. The review board's report on the incident contained a section that was separate from the sections on the officers and the complainants and the administrative misconduct, a section that was titled, in the careful language of official documents, "Contributing Factors in the Delayed Transmission of Contradictory Witness Information," and which was in the plain language of what it actually described, the section about Vanessa. She had testified at the board's inquiry, and she had testified the way she had given her statement in the parking structure accurately and completely, without softening the things about herself that were difficult to include, because the value of a testimony is determined by whether it describes what actually happened, and Vanessa understood this the way you understand things that you have had to decide, rather than things you have simply always believed. She told the board about the 3 minutes. She described watching the confrontation develop, watching Preston call 911, watching the story being constructed around Darius, and feeling the specific, practical weight of the Whitfield name on 3 active permits in the district she worked in. The weight that made silence feel for approximately 180 seconds like the professional choice, and like the personal choice, and like the only choice that was available to someone in her position, which was a position without the protections that formal authority provides. She also described the 4th minute. She described picking up the handset and calling in her statement with her name attached on the record, because at the 4-minute mark, she had looked at what was happening in front of her and understood that the alternative silence, the preservation of professional comfort at the cost of what was true, was a choice she was not willing to make, and that the inability of the system to protect her from the risks of speaking was a problem the system needed to solve, but not a problem that justified her participation in an outcome she knew to be wrong. The board's report noted both things, not the hesitation alone, not the decision alone, but both together in the sequence in which they had occurred, because the sequence was the true account, and the true account was what the record required. The reform that addressed Vanessa's situation was less visible than the dispatch protocol reform, but it mattered in a different and perhaps more important way. Witness statements from facility personnel, parking attendants, transit workers, security staff would henceforth receive equal procedural weight to caller statements in the initial dispatch record. There would be a formal, simple process for these individuals to submit real-time observations without going through the general notes queue where the submission sat in a lower priority buffer and might not surface to responding officers before the interaction resolved. The reform acknowledged, in the plain language of a policy document, that the workers who occupied these stations saw things that callers did not, that they had access and angle that was often superior to anyone else's, and that the system had been organized in a way that treated their observations as supplementary rather than primary, which was an organizational choice that had no evidentiary basis, and that the parking lot incident had demonstrated with considerable clarity to be a failure worth correcting. 3 months after the incident, Vanessa was at her monitoring station when a call came in. A caller was reporting that a man standing beside an expensive SUV in the Riverstone Commons lot could not possibly be its owner based on his appearance and clothing. She watched the dispatcher's screen from where she sat. The caller's account was logged under the new field heading, Unverified Claim. The system then automatically ran the plate. Before any alert was generated, the plate came back registered, current, no flags. The registration record opened. The suspect field remained locked, grayed out, inaccessible until the objective data was complete. The dispatcher typed a single note. Ownership confirmed, no threat identified, no response generated. Vanessa watched the screen for a moment after the note appeared. She did not say anything. She did not make a call or send a message or reach out to anyone to mark what she was observing. She just watched the screen do what it had always been supposed to do, what it would have done 3 months ago if the system had been built the way it was built now, and she thought about the 4 minutes, and she thought about the note she had typed at 3:31 on a Thursday afternoon in October, and she thought about what the gap between typing the note and the note being transmitted had cost, and about what the reform was designed to prevent the next gap from costing. Then another vehicle pulled through the entrance gate, and her tablet logged the plate, and she returned to the work of her shift. The losses arrived in sequence, and the sequence was worse than a single collapse would have been, because a single collapse at least has the mercy of being over, and what Preston experienced instead was the particular extended unraveling of a life organized around relationships that were, it turned out, transactional in a direction he had always assumed ran the other way. The Caldwell Club sent a letter 2 weeks after the plea agreement became public record. The letter described a membership conduct review that had been initiated by the board, and it informed him that his membership privileges had been suspended pending the outcome of that review, and it was signed by the club secretary in a font that was tasteful and impersonal, and that communicated in the specific language of institutions that have been maintaining their dignity for a long time, that the institution would continue maintaining its dignity, and that Preston was currently an obstacle to that maintenance. He had paid $85,000 to join this room. The letter arrived in an envelope with the club's return address printed in the same restrained font as everything else the club produced, and he read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, and then he placed it in the pile of correspondence that had been accumulating since the plea, though. Correspondence from attorneys and auditors and the procurement board and the city administrator's office and his own CFO, who had resigned 2 days after the procurement audit was published and whose resignation letter had been 3 sentences long. His son Tyler called him on the Saturday after the plea agreement was announced. Tyler was 26 and lived in Richmond and worked in environmental consulting, and had from the time he was about 19 been developing the specific kind of quiet distance from his father that children develop when they have watched a parent operate in the world long enough to understand how the parent operates in the world and have decided that they do not want to operate the same way. Tyler did not ask for an explanation of what had happened in the parking lot. He asked one question. "Dad," he said, "did you know that man has lived in Caldwell his entire life? And you had never once thought about whether you would recognize him?" Preston did not answer the question. Tyler did not call again for 6 weeks. Celeste removed her social media accounts not from remorse, not from any internal accounting of what her actions in the parking lot and afterward had cost the people they had cost, but from the practical recognition that the platforms were no longer serving her purpose and had become a liability that she was not willing to carry forward. She told Preston one evening in the kitchen of the house that had taken them 20 years to consider good enough that she thought they should consider spending more time at the lake property. Preston looked out the window. He did not respond. The Whitfield Development Group's CFO had resigned. The pending bids were canceled. The 3 existing contracts under compliance review were generating questions from the review board that required responses from Preston, and the responses required the kind of documentation that in at least 2 cases was going to be difficult to provide without acknowledging decisions that had been made in the expectation that they would never need to be documented. The company did not collapse in a single moment. It diminished the way things diminish when the informal arrangements that held them together are quietly removed contract by contract and relationship by relationship. The phone calls that used to carry deals now going unreturned, the introductions that used to flow from certain friendships no longer flowing, the room that had always had space for Preston Whitfield no longer certain of his arrival. He sat at his office desk on a Thursday afternoon doing paperwork. The desk had always been a desk where things were decided, where contracts were reviewed and relationships were managed, and the specific informal work of a man with Preston's ambitions was conducted through phone calls and emails, and the kind of conversation that happens when you know which corner of a restaurant to sit in and which table the waiter always brings the check to without being asked. Now it was a desk where paperwork happened. The phone was quiet in the way that phones are quiet when the calls that used to come have stopped coming, and Preston worked through the paperwork with the focused efficiency of a man who has lost the thing that made the work mean something and is continuing to do the work anyway because stopping would require acknowledging what has been lost, and acknowledgement was something Preston Whitfield had always been, until recently, very good at avoiding. The filing cabinet behind him held 30 years of documents. He did not look at it. Several months after the Thursday in October, Darius returned to Riverstone Commons for a community compliance review, which was a routine part of his responsibilities as sheriff, a quarterly assessment of the dispatch protocols in commercial districts with high pedestrian and parking activity, the kind of administrative work that constitutes the majority of what running a county law enforcement agency actually involves, as opposed to the dramatic version of that work that most people imagine when they imagine a sheriff. It was a Tuesday in February, and the winter light over Riverstone Commons was different from the October light, flatter without that amber, tilted quality, the kind of light that shows everything clearly without making it look more expensive than it is. And the district was quieter than it had been in October, the post-holiday quieter of a commercial space that has exhaled and not yet reinflated to capacity. The Escalade passed beneath the parking structure's entrance camera at 10:14 a.m. The gate system registered the plate in the same automatic, unhurried way it registered every plate, checked it against the same database it always checked, returned the same result. Caldwell DM, registered owner, no flags, no alerts. Added a timestamp to the log, let the vehicle through. He parked in the second row, the same row. The compliance review meeting was in a conference room on the third floor of the district management office, and it ran an hour and 40 minutes, and it covered the implementation of the new dispatch protocol across the district's 4 traffic monitoring stations, the technical integration between the parking management system and the updated witness statement submission interface, and 3 minor procedural questions from facility supervisors about edge cases that the new protocol hadn't anticipated and that required clarification from the county's guidelines document. It was, in every meaningful sense, ordinary. Afterward, Darius stopped at the monitoring station on the parking structure's second level. He had a question about the technical integration, a legitimate logistical question about the lag time between a facility worker's submission and its appearance in the active dispatch display. A question with operational implications for the protocol and that had come up in the meeting without a clear answer. Vanessa was at her station. She had seen the Escalade pull through the gate on her log, and she had noted it the way she noted things accurately without elaboration, and she had not reached out or sent a message or done anything to mark the awareness, because the professional relationship between a facility coordinator and the county sheriff does not require the acknowledgement of every mutual awareness, and Vanessa understood this. She answered the logistical question clearly and specifically with the information she had from her own daily experience of using the new interface, which was more useful than the technical documentation because it was the information of actual practice rather than intended design, and she pulled up the screen to show him the submission flow in real time. There was a vehicle call active on the system while they were talking a routine parking dispute 2 levels below a question of whether a vehicle was in a handicap space with or without appropriate credentials, and Darius watched the protocol handle it the way you watch a new process run when you are responsible for whether it works. The plate was checked first. The credentials were verified through the DMV database. The caller's account was logged under the updated framework with the factual elements and the unverified elements separated in the display so that what the caller claimed and what the system could confirm appeared in distinct columns rather than as a single undifferentiated alert. He watched it resolve without drama. He thanked Vanessa. She nodded in the professional, composed way of someone who has been through something consequential with another person and has arrived at the specific register of mutual respect that does not require elaboration or warmth to be real. Before he turned to leave, Darius placed his key on the counter. Not symbolically. Not as a gesture or a statement or a reference to anything in particular. His hands were full of the folder from the compliance meeting, his phone, his notepad, and he set the key down on the edge of the counter while he reorganized what he was carrying. The uncomplicated, practical action of a person who needs a flat surface for a moment. He picked it up again 30 seconds later when his hands were free, dropped it into his jacket pocket, and walked back through the parking structure toward the second row. The Escalade was exactly where he had left it. He unlocked it with the fob, the headlights flashed twice, the clean, bright pulse of it, the mirrors unfolded with the quiet, mechanical precision he had heard 100 times since buying the car. The door locks released with the solid, satisfying thunk that echoed briefly off the concrete pillar behind him. The same sound as October. He got in. He settled into the seat. He put both hands on the wheel in the loose, habitual position of a man who drives as regularly as he does. For a moment, he sat without starting the engine. Not long, 30 seconds perhaps, the same interval he had sat in the gas station parking lot 3 blocks south on the October afternoon, but long enough to be present in the moment rather than passing through it, because this parking structure had a cost attached to it, and he was not finished paying that cost down into something he could carry without it weighing more than it needed to. He looked at the obsidian hood in the flat February light, the deep liquid, absolute black of it, absorbing the parking structure's overhead fluorescence rather than reflecting it, the same black he had seen in a magazine in a waiting room when he was 9 years old, and had thought was the most serious and beautiful thing he had ever seen. The black that Gloria had recognized in the photo he sent her. The black that made her say his daddy would have cried, which he would have. From the specific combination of pride and anger that men of Robert Caldwell's generation carried when they watched the world do to their children the things it had done to them. No one was standing at the door. That was the only difference. Everything else was the same. The same car, the same key, the same light, the same hands on the same wheel in the same parking structure. And the difference was the entire distance between a man who has been told he does not belong where he has arrived, and a man who has arrived where he belongs and is recognized as such. He started the engine. The car responded with the immediate, reliable precision of a vehicle maintained correctly by someone who pays attention to it, and he pulled out of the space and drove toward the exit ramp, and as he passed beneath the gate camera, the system logged the plate one more time. Caldwell DM. Registered owner, no flags, no alerts, and added the timestamp to the record of an ordinary man leaving an ordinary parking structure on an ordinary Tuesday morning in February. On the monitoring station screen, the log entries sat beside the entries for the 17 other vehicles that had passed through since the morning shift started. No different from any of them. Exactly as it should have been all along. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, organizations, and events depicted are entirely the product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or to actual events or institutions is coincidental. If this story moved you, if you saw something in it that reminded you of a truth you've been carrying, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. The stories that start conversations are the ones that matter most. And if you want more stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next.